The Arab Spring was a revolutionary wave of protests, demonstrations, and uprisings that spread across the Middle East and North Africa starting in late 2010 and early 2011. It profoundly changed the political landscape of the region, challenging long-standing authoritarian regimes and reshaping the social, political, and economic dynamics of several nations. Understanding the Arab Spring requires examining its origins, key events, major players, the role of social media, the responses from governments, and its long-lasting impacts. Origins of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was the result of decades of political repression, economic hardship, and social inequality across the Arab world. Many of these countries had authoritarian regimes that had held power for decades, relying on security forces, censorship, and cronyism to maintain control. Unemployment was rampant, particularly among young people, and economic opportunities were scarce for large segments of the population. Corruption within governments only exacerbated the situation, leading to widespread frustration. A critical factor that sparked the Arab Spring was the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor in Tunisia, on December 17, 2010. Bouazizi's act of protest, after being humiliated by local officials and having his wares confiscated, resonated with millions across the Arab world. His death became a symbol of the broader injustice faced by the common man under oppressive regimes. Tunisia became the epicenter of what would grow into a transnational movement for reform. Now let's talk about the key events of the Arab Spring. Tunisia, the catalyst for change. Tunisia was where the Arab Spring began, and it is often hailed as its most successful case. After weeks of protests, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled the country for 23 years, was forced to flee to Saudi Arabia on January 14, 2011. Tunisia transitioned into a democratic system with a new constitution and held free elections, giving hope that other Arab countries might follow a similar path toward democratization. Egypt, from Tahrir Square to regime change. Following Tunisia's revolution, Egypt became the next major hotspot for the Arab Spring. Massive protests broke out in Cairo's Tahrir Square, with demonstrators calling for an end to President Hosni Mubarak's 30-year rule. Social media played a crucial role in organizing protests and spreading awareness, with platforms like Facebook and Twitter allowing activists to communicate and mobilize large numbers of people. Mubarak's government responded with force, but after 18 days of continuous protests and growing international pressure, Mubarak resigned on February 11, 2011. However, Egypt's transition to democracy proved challenging. The Muslim Brotherhood, a long-oppressed Islamist group, won elections in 2012, but their time in power was short-lived. The military, under General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, staged a coup in 2013, leading to a new era of military rule that many saw as a return to authoritarianism. Libya, civil war and the fall of Gaddafi. Libya's experience of the Arab Spring was much bloodier and more chaotic than that of Tunisia or Egypt. Protests against Muammar Gaddafi, who had ruled Libya for 42 years, quickly escalated into an armed conflict. Gaddafi's forces responded with brutal repression, prompting an international outcry. The United Nations authorized a NATO intervention, and Western military forces launched airstrikes in support of the rebels. Gaddafi's regime eventually collapsed in August 2011, and Gaddafi himself was captured and killed in October of that year. However, the fall of Gaddafi did not bring stability to Libya. The country descended into civil war, with various factions, militias, and Islamist groups vying for control, and the state has since remained fractured and unstable. Syria, from protests to protracted civil war. The Arab Spring also reached Syria, where protests initially began as peaceful demonstrations calling for political reform. However, the regime of President Bashar al-Assad responded with extreme violence, using military force to crush dissent. The situation quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war, with various rebel groups, including Islamist factions, fighting against Assad's forces. Over time, the conflict became a proxy war, with international actors like Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah supporting the Assad regime, while Western countries and Gulf states backed different rebel groups. The rise of ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, further complicated the war, and Syria has remained in a state of chaos ever since, with millions of people displaced and hundreds of thousands killed. Yemen, revolution and civil war. In Yemen, longtime President Ali Abdullah Saleh faced mass protests that were part of the wider Arab Spring movement. The demonstrations eventually led to his ousting in 2012, with Saleh agreeing to transfer power to his vice president, Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi. However, Yemen's political transition soon unraveled. The Houthi rebel movement, which had been marginalized for years, took advantage of the chaos to seize control of large parts of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. This led to a civil war, with Saudi Arabia intervening on behalf of Hadi's government. The war has had devastating humanitarian consequences, leading to widespread famine and disease, as well as a protracted military conflict with no clear end in sight. The role of social media. One of the defining features of the Arab Spring was the role of social media in facilitating the protests and uprisings. In countries where state-controlled media had long silenced dissenting voices, platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube provided a space for people to share information, organize protests, and expose government repression to the outside world. Social media allowed activists to bypass state censorship and spread their messages to a global audience. It also helped protesters in different countries learn from one another and coordinate their actions. While social media was a powerful tool for mobilization, it also had limitations. In some cases, authoritarian regimes were able to track down activists through their online activities, and the initial optimism about the democratizing power of the internet has since been tempered by the realization that social media can also be used to spread disinformation and stoke division. Government responses: repression versus reform. The governments of the countries affected by the Arab Spring responded in different ways to the protests. Some, like Tunisia, took steps toward political reform, recognizing that they could not maintain their grip on power indefinitely. Others, like Egypt, saw temporary success in toppling regimes, only to experience a return to authoritarianism later. In many cases, rulers opted for brutal repression. Assad's regime in Syria, for instance, showed no signs of compromise, unleashing the full force of its military to crush dissent. In the Gulf states, wealthy monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates responded to the Arab Spring by tightening their grip on power, while also using financial handouts and security crackdowns to prevent protests from gaining traction. In Bahrain, a Gulf monarchy with a significant Shiite population, protests were violently suppressed with the help of Saudi forces, and the regime remained in place. Long-term impacts of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring left a mixed legacy. In some cases, it brought about genuine political change and reform, but in many others, it led to instability, civil war, and the resurgence of authoritarianism. Tunisia stands out as the most successful case, transitioning to a democracy with a vibrant civil society. However, even Tunisia has faced economic difficulties and political tensions in the years since the revolution. In Egypt, the hopes for democracy that were raised by the 2011 revolution have been dashed by the re-emergence of military rule under President Sisi, who has consolidated power and cracked down on dissent. Libya and Yemen remain mired in civil war, and Syria's conflict has devastated the country and its people, with no clear resolution in sight. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the Arab Spring has been the redefinition of the relationship between the people and their governments in the Arab world. While many regimes have survived, the events of 2011 demonstrated that popular discontent could not be ignored indefinitely. The uprising shattered the myth of the unshakable Arab dictator and showed that even the most entrenched authoritarian regimes could be brought to their knees by the power of mass protest. However, the Arab Spring also highlighted the complexity of achieving lasting change in a region with deep-seated political, social, and economic challenges. While the initial protests were driven by demands for freedom, dignity, and justice, the outcomes have been shaped by broader regional and international dynamics, including sectarianism, the intervention of foreign powers, and the influence of Islamist movements. The Arab Spring was a momentous chapter in the modern history of the Middle East and North Africa. It revealed the deep frustrations of ordinary citizens with their governments and sparked a wave of protests that swept across borders. While the revolutions led to the downfall of several regimes, the road to democracy and stability has proven to be long and difficult. For many, the promise of the Arab Spring remains unfulfilled, but its legacy continues to influence the region's political trajectory today. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.